Chapter 1: The Invitation. The rain fell in heavy sheets, drenching the streets and turning the city into a maze of gleaming wet cobblestones. Deep within the heart of this urban labyrinth stood an old, forgotten restaurant, La Maison des Ombres. Its name, House of Shadows, was scrawled in faded letters above the entrance, barely visible through the grime and age. The restaurant had been closed for decades, yet tonight, light flickered within, a dim and ghostly glow seeping through the cracks in the windows. No one knew how the invitations were sent or why they were received. Each one was unique, addressed to people who had never heard of the restaurant, who had no reason to visit such a forsaken place. Yet, when the clock struck midnight, they all found themselves drawn to La Maison des Ombres, clutching the black envelopes they had received earlier that day. Sarah was among them. She was a food critic, seasoned in her field, but there was something about this invitation that unsettled her. It wasn't the elegant script on the envelope or the lack of a return address, it was the whisper that accompanied it, a voice that seemed to slither into her mind, urging her to attend. "Join us for a feast," the invitation read. "A night of culinary delight that you will never forget." Sarah's curiosity overcame her fear, as it had so many times before. She arrived at the restaurant, pushing open the heavy door with a creak that echoed into the night. The interior was bathed in the warm, flickering light of candles, their flames casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. A small group of guests had already gathered inside, strangers to one another, yet bound by the same mysterious call. There was Thomas, a washed-up actor with a drink in his hand, Emily, a nervous young woman who kept glancing over her shoulder, and Robert, a businessman with a stern expression, his eyes darting around the room, assessing every detail. The maitre d'hotel, an elderly man with a gaunt face and hollow eyes, appeared from the darkness. His smile was cold, almost predatory, as he greeted them. "Welcome to La Maison des Ombres," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "Tonight, we have prepared a feast unlike any other. Please, follow me." He led them through the dimly lit dining room, past tables draped in white cloths and adorned with tarnished silverware. The walls were covered in dark, heavy tapestries that seemed to absorb the light, making the room feel smaller, suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something metallic and sharp. At the far end of the room was a large, round table, set for 5. The guests exchanged uneasy glances as they took their seats, the chairs creaking under their weight. In the center of the table was a silver cloche, hiding the first course of their meal. The maitre d'hotel stepped forward, his skeletal hand reaching out to lift the cloche. "The feast begins," he murmured, his eyes gleaming with something dark and malicious. "Bon appetit." Chapter 2: The First Course. As the cloche was lifted, a thick, coppery scent filled the air, causing the guests to recoil in their seats. The dish beneath was a mound of raw meat, glistening with fresh blood. It was unrecognizable, cut into jagged pieces, some still twitching as if alive. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through the group, but the maitre d'hotel remained unfazed, his smile widening as he observed their reactions. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This was no ordinary meal, this was something else, something vile. But before she could voice her concerns, the maitre d'hotel spoke again. "Do not be deceived by appearances," he said, his voice a low, soothing purr. "What you see before you is not what it seems. This is a delicacy, a rare and exquisite dish that can only be experienced here, in this place, on this night." He gestured towards the plates in front of them, urging them to take a bite. The guests hesitated, their instincts screaming at them to flee, but the maitre d'hotel's gaze held them captive, as if his very will was seeping into their minds, pushing them to obey. Thomas was the first to succumb. His hand shook as he picked up his fork, spearing a piece of the raw meat and bringing it to his lips. His face twisted in revulsion, but as the morsel touched his tongue, his expression changed. His eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in pleasure. He chewed slowly, savoring the flavor, a low moan escaping his throat. It's incredible," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "I've never tasted anything like it." The others watched in horror as Thomas continued to eat, his movements becoming more frantic, more desperate with each bite. The blood smeared across his lips, his teeth, but he didn't care. He was lost in the taste, the sensation, the sheer ecstasy of it. One by one, the other guests followed suit. Robert, with a sneer of contempt, took a tentative bite, his disdain melting into shock as the flavor overtook him. Emily, trembling with fear, hesitated the longest, but eventually, she too succumbed, unable to resist the lure of the food. Sarah was the last. She stared down at her plate, bile rising in her throat as she forced herself to reach out. The meat was cold and slick beneath her fingers, but when she lifted it to her mouth, a strange compulsion drove her to eat. The taste exploded in her mouth, rich and dark, a symphony of flavors that defied description. It was as if she was consuming pure pleasure, every nerve in her body singing with delight. But as the initial shock wore off, a creeping dread began to settle over the table. The guests, once lost in the rapture of the food, now felt something else, something wrong. Their stomachs churned, their skin prickled with cold sweat. The room seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. And then the whispers began. They were faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, like the murmur of distant voices. But as the guests sat in silence, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke in a language none of them understood, yet the meaning was clear, threatening, ominous, filled with malice. Sarah clutched the edge of the table, her heart pounding in her chest. The food in her mouth turned to ash, the pleasure replaced by a sickening sense of dread. She glanced at the others, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with fear. What is happening?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The maitre d'hôtel, who had been watching them with cold, calculating eyes, stepped forward. "The first course is always the most unsettling," he said, his tone almost mocking. "But do not worry. It will pass. You must simply allow the food to digest." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving the guests alone with their fear. Chapter 3: The Second Course. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the dimly lit room. Minutes felt like hours as the guests sat in silence, the weight of their dread growing heavier with each passing second. The whispers that had filled the air earlier had subsided, but their echoes lingered, a haunting reminder of the strange and malevolent presence that surrounded them. Finally, the maitre d'hôtel returned, gliding into the room with a silent grace that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. He carried with him a new dish, covered once again by a gleaming silver cloche. The guests exchanged nervous glances, their fear now mingled with a twisted curiosity. "The second course," the maitre d'hôtel announced, placing the dish at the center of the table. His eyes gleamed with a dark amusement as he removed the cloche with a flourish. The dish beneath was a stark contrast to the raw meat of the first course. It was a delicate creation, artfully arranged on the plate, thin slices of what appeared to be fish, shimmering with a strange iridescence, drizzled with a deep, crimson sauce. The presentation was beautiful, almost mesmerizing, but there was something about it that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Enjoy," the maitre d'hôtel said, stepping back into the shadows, his presence still looming over them. The guests hesitated, but the hunger that had been sparked by the first course was still there, gnawing at their insides. Despite their fear, they reached for their forks, driven by a compulsion they could not explain. Sarah was the first to taste it this time. The fish melted on her tongue, the texture so delicate it was almost unreal. The sauce was rich and sweet, with an undertone of bitterness that left a lingering taste in her mouth. It was delicious, yet there was something about it that felt wrong. As the others ate, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows creeping closer. The whispers returned, louder now, filling their minds with dark thoughts, twisted images that made their blood run cold. Thomas dropped his fork, his hand shaking violently. What are they saying?" he gasped, his eyes wild with terror. "I can hear them, in my head." Emily clutched her temples, rocking back and forth in her seat. "Make it stop," she whimpered. "Please, make it stop." But there was no escape. The whispers were inside them now, clawing at their minds, tearing at their sanity. The once delightful taste of the food turned to poison in their mouths, burning their throats, searing their insides. Robert doubled over, clutching his stomach as a wave of nausea hit him. He tried to speak, but only a choked gurgle escaped his lips. Blood trickled from his nose, his eyes, as he collapsed onto the table, convulsing violently. Sarah screamed, jumping to her feet, but her legs gave way beneath her. She fell to the floor, the room spinning around her. The shadows seemed to come alive, reaching out with cold, skeletal hands, wrapping around her, pulling her into darkness. The maitre d'hotel's voice cut through the chaos, cold and detached. "The second course is transformative," he said. "It reveals the truth that lies beneath the surface, the darkness within us all. Some cannot handle it, others embrace it." His words were the last thing Sarah heard before the darkness swallowed her whole. Chapter 4: The Third Course. When Sarah awoke, she was no longer in the dining room. She was in a small, dimly lit chamber, the air thick with the stench of decay. Her body ached, her head throbbed with pain, and her stomach churned with a sickening mixture of hunger and dread. She pushed herself up, her hands sinking into the damp, moldy floor. The walls around her were covered in dark, glistening stains, and the only light came from a flickering candle in the corner, its flame barely illuminating the room. She wasn't alone. The other guests were there, scattered around the room in various states of distress. Thomas lay curled up in a ball, muttering to himself, his eyes wide and unblinking. Emily sat against the wall, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Robert was slumped in the corner, his body limp and lifeless, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. Sarah's heart raced as she took in the scene. This wasn't a meal, it was a nightmare, a twisted, perverse game. She had to get out. She had to escape this place before it consumed her. But as she tried to stand, the door to the chamber creaked open, and the maitre d'hotel entered, carrying another dish. The smell hit her immediately, something rancid, something rotten. It was a stench so foul it made her gag. "The third course," the maitre d'hotel announced, placing the dish on the floor in front of them. This time, there was no cloche, no attempt to disguise the horror of what lay within. The dish was filled with what looked like rotting flesh, covered in maggots that writhed and squirmed across the surface. The sight of it made Sarah's stomach heave, but there was something even more disturbing, a faint, pulsing glow emanating from within the decaying meat. "You must eat," the maitre d'hotel said, his voice calm and emotionless. "The feast is not yet complete." Sarah shook her head, backing away from the dish. No, I can't. I won't." But the hunger was there, gnawing at her insides, growing stronger with each passing moment. It wasn't just a physical hunger, it was something deeper, something primal, something that demanded to be fed. Thomas was the first to break. With a cry of despair, he lunged at the dish, his hands tearing at the rotten meat, shoving it into his mouth with a frenzy born of desperation. His eyes rolled back in his head as he devoured it, the maggots squirming between his teeth, the glowing flesh burning his throat. Emily screamed, but the sound was cut off as she too was overcome by the hunger. She grabbed a handful of the decaying flesh, her hands trembling as she forced it into her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Sarah fought against it, but the hunger was too strong. It clawed at her, tearing at her mind, until she could resist no longer. With a sob of defeat, she reached out, her fingers sinking into the rotting flesh, the maggots crawling over her skin. The taste was worse than anything she could have imagined. It was like death, decay, and corruption all rolled into one. But the hunger drove her to keep eating, to consume every last bit of the foul, glowing meat. As they ate, the light within the flesh grew brighter, filling the room with a sickly, unnatural glow. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, drilling into their minds, filling them with dark thoughts, terrible visions. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The dish was empty, the hunger sated. But the guests, they were changed. The light had entered them, seeped into their very souls, corrupting them, twisting them. Sarah could feel it inside her, a cold, dark presence that coiled around her heart, squeezing the life out of her. She looked at the others, saw the same darkness in their eyes, the same corruption. They were no longer themselves. They were something else. Chapter 5: The Final Course. The chamber was silent, save for the sound of their ragged breathing. The maitre d'hotel stood by the door, watching them with that same cold, predatory smile. He seemed pleased with what he saw, as if the transformation he had orchestrated was exactly what he had intended. "The final course," he announced, his voice echoing in the stillness. The door behind him creaked open, and a group of shadowy figures entered the room. They moved with an unnatural grace, their forms shifting and flickering in the dim light. Their faces were hidden in the darkness, but their eyes glowed with the same sickly light that had filled the chamber. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what they were: previous guests, those who had come before, who had partaken in the feast and been consumed by it. They were hollowed out, empty shells, their souls replaced by the darkness that now filled them. The figures surrounded them, their glowing eyes fixed on the remaining guests. There was no malice in their gaze, only a cold, detached hunger. The maître d'hôtel stepped forward, his skeletal hand gesturing towards the door. "It is time," he said. "The feast is complete. You are ready to join us." Thomas and Emily moved as if in a trance, their eyes glazed over, their bodies swaying as they followed the shadowy figures out of the chamber. They didn't resist, didn't fight, there was nothing left of them to do so. But Sarah. Sarah still had a spark of defiance left in her. She stumbled to her feet, her body weak and trembling, but her mind still clung to a shred of hope, a desperate will to survive. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I won't. I can't." The maître d'hôtel turned his gaze on her, his eyes narrowing. "You have no choice," he said, his voice cold and final. "You are one of us now. There is no escape." But Sarah didn't listen. She gathered the last of her strength and ran, pushing past the shadowy figures, her feet pounding against the cold, stone floor. The hallway stretched out before her, dark and endless, but she didn't care. She had to get out, had to escape the darkness that was closing in around her. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to claw their way into her mind. The shadows stretched and twisted, reaching out for her, but she kept running, refusing to look back. Finally, she saw it, the entrance, the door that led back to the world outside, to freedom. It was so close, just within reach. But as she reached for the handle, something cold and sharp wrapped around her ankle, yanking her back. She screamed, her fingers clawing at the door, but it was no use. The shadows were pulling her back, dragging her down into the darkness. The last thing she saw was the maître d'hôtel standing in the doorway, his smile wide and cruel. "The feast is never truly over," he said, his voice echoing in her mind. "Not until every last guest has been served." And then the darkness swallowed her whole. The next day, La Maison des Ombres stood empty once more, its doors closed, its windows dark. The rain had washed away any trace of the night before, leaving the city to go about its business as if nothing had happened. But deep within the heart of the restaurant, the shadows stirred, whispering of the next feast, the next invitation. And somewhere in the city, another black envelope was being delivered, ready to draw on the next unsuspecting guest. The Feast of Shadows would continue, as it always had, and always would.